So let me just introduce Julian Betts to get to our discussion today about math testing. Julian is a Bren Fellow at PPIC. He is also a professor of economics at UC San Diego. He has done a variety of work at PPIC over the last couple of years that looks at interventions to improve academic performance in K through 12 years. He looked at a study on the high school exit exam, about reading reforms, and today we'll talk about math diagnostics. Julian studied economics at Oxford and got his PhD at Queen's University, and he's here to talk to us today about math diagnostics. Welcome, Julian.
Well, thank you, Dave, and welcome to all of you. As Dave said, I'm going to be talking today about diagnostic testing in math and whether it makes a difference for student learning. Before I get started, I just want to thank the Donald Bren Foundation and the California Academic Partnership Program, which have funded the research that you're going to be hearing about today. The specific type of diagnostic math testing we have in mind, many of you will already know about. It's called the Math Diagnostic Testing Project. This is available freely statewide to any math teacher at the middle school or high school level. We're lucky to have here today the statewide director of CAP, Andrea Ball, and also the state director of MDTP, Bruce Arnold. So if you ask any really difficult questions, I'm going to point you towards them. We wanted to know whether this diagnostic testing really makes a difference. So let's talk a little bit about what the MDTP is. The MDTP provides tests that diagnose student strengths and weaknesses in very specific math skills. So it's very detailed. That's the first thing you should know about it. The second thing is that the turnaround is extremely fast. During the period that we're going to be studying, 2002 through 2007, the tests were mostly pencil and paper. Teachers could expect to get the results within 5 working days, usually less than that. There's now an online version of the MDTP tests. So in that case, teachers can get the results virtually instantaneously. The MDTP is a joint program of Cal State and the University of California. I think its roots go all the way back to 1977, with tests being available starting in the early 1980s. It's available to all California schools. It's actually much broader than that. California's community colleges use these tests. Cal State uses it, and so does the University of California to assess the math skills of incoming freshmen. One of the keys for MDTP is that it has 10 regional centers around the state. So if you're a teacher and you decide to use this test, you send the test into the regional center. You get the test back more quickly that way, and in addition, staff from that center can come to your school and talk to teachers about what the test results mean and how to use them. In addition to the tests, this project also provides some written response items that teachers can use to try to strengthen their students' skills in specific areas. So the MDTP is really quite distinct from the test that most of us know better, which is the California Standards Test. This is the statewide test required under the state accountability system, which tests students in grades 2 through 11 annually in math and English language arts, and also in some other subjects in specific grades. What makes this different from the CST? Well, the MDTP is really intended to be a diagnostic tool. It's not used for state accountability. It provides a little bit more detail than the CST does in terms of individual students' strengths and weaknesses on things like fractions, percentages, and the like. The CST test results during the period we studied were coming back to districts in late August. That's too late for a teacher in the year of testing to actually use the results to intervene in any way or to assign students to summer school. So that's another difference with the state test. Just to give you a sense of use of the MDTP statewide, on the left side here, we've got the number of participating schools, and it's been rising from just below 1,500 to just under 2,000 in recent years. The right-hand side graph that you see here shows the number of tests administered statewide by year. For the latest year we have, 06-07, it's up around 700,000 tests. Now, to put this into perspective, if all those tests were being given to middle and high school students in public schools in California, and each student was given at most one test, it would mean that about 20% of students in middle and high schools in California were being given an MDTP test. So this is a very widespread test, widely used in California. Here's an example, a mock-up of the sort of feedback that individual students would get. Teachers get these letters and pass them on to their students. So teachers get very detailed information on strengths and weaknesses of individual students. They also get the frequency of responses, A, B, C, and D, to each multiple choice question for their entire classroom. That's really important because these are multiple choice tests that have a lot of distractors built into them. So if you see lots of students answering question 2, B, and B is the wrong answer because it's got a distractor built in where you're adding the denominators instead of finding the lowest common denominator, that gives a teacher a very strong clue as to what the lack of understanding is. So you see up here, the students are getting a lot of information on various strands, integers, fractions, and their applications, and so on. Now, we're going to be examining the use of MDTP specifically in San Diego Unified School District. We've been working with San Diego Unified School District at UCSD for 11 years now through something called the San Diego Education Research Alliance at UCSD. San Diego is the second largest district in California. We did some work for PPIC about 8 years ago. At that time, and I think this is still true, San Diego Unified's demographics resembled the statewide demographics better than any of the other large districts in the state. Now, it turns out that in San Diego Unified, the MDTP has been used in two quite distinct ways. The first emphasis that the district put in place around fall 2000 was mandating that all students in certain grades should be given one of these tests in May or June. And this was used to help math teachers place students into appropriate classes in math for the following fall. It was also used, along with a lot of other information, by teachers to figure out which students should be recommended for summer school. So those were some of the specific goals of the mandated all-grade testing that began in 2000 to 2001. Now, there's a second use of MDTP in the district which much more closely resembles the use of these tests statewide, and that is that any teacher on his or her own can voluntarily contact one of the regional offices, get one of the readiness tests, say the algebra readiness test, and to give it to his or her class at the start of the school year, middle of the school year, or end of the school year. This has been going on in San Diego literally for decades, as it has in districts statewide. So we'll be looking at both what we call mandated use of MDTP, which means mandatory testing of every student in a given grade, and the voluntary use by individual teachers. Now, because of these two quite distinct uses, we have to adopt slightly different methods for looking at whether the use of these tests actually made any difference for students. For the mandated MDTP, we're sort of in luck because this is what an economist would call a natural experiment. It wasn't a decision made by an individual student to be tested or an individual teacher or even a principal. It was a district-wide policy that in certain years, everybody in grade 6 and grade 7 had to be tested. Earlier in the period that we study, everybody in grade 8 and grade 9 had to be tested with MDTP. So essentially what we can do is follow individual students over time and look for a blip in their achievement growth in years when they were subject to this mandated testing compared to the years when they were not. For voluntary testing, we don't have a similar natural experiment. In other words, a policy that's imposed from on high. Instead, what we have is individual math teachers who decide this would be a really good thing to do for 3 classes. Now, it could be that the teachers who decide to use this test voluntarily are not average teachers. They could be better than average, worse than average, and it could be that the individual classrooms they choose to test are not typical classrooms either. In fact, there's some evidence I'll talk about later that when teachers voluntarily tested, it tended to be on classrooms where the incoming achievement of the students was actually rather weak. So that poses some challenges for us in terms of trying to ferret out a causal link between testing and later student outcomes. Let me tell you a little bit about the data sources and the years we study. We're going to be studying the school years 2001-2002 through 2006 through 2007. During this period, as you can see, there were over 165,000 MDTP tests given in the district. For the mandated tests, it's very easy for us to get these because these were integrated into the administrative records that the district holds, and we've been working with the administrative records of the district for, 11 years now. Along with that information from the administrative records, we can pull out a lot of other relevant information, such as previous scores in the California Standards Test of each student, the classroom setting, by which I mean the class size, the initial achievement of the students' peers in the classroom, and very detailed characteristics and qualifications of the actual math teacher who taught a specific student. For the voluntary tests, we instead obtained the information from the San Diego regional office because when an individual teacher voluntarily asks for one of her classes to be tested, the data do not go to the district. So we received a very large database from the regional office, and it took quite a few months, but we managed to match those student records to about 80% level with the administrative records that we already had from the district. So there might be a little bit of undercounting in terms of who is voluntarily tested, but we've got a pretty good match there. This table tells you a little bit about the mandated testing. What we're showing here in each row is an academic year, and each column shows a grade level, and this is showing the percentage of students who participated in mandated MDTP testing each year. The numbers that are in bold font represent years and grades where there was mandated testing, where everybody was supposed to be tested. There's one little gray area here, grade 6 and 04-05. It was mandated, but only in certain classrooms. If you look at the bold numbers, they're generally pretty close to 75 to 100%. In the technical appendix to this report, which is available online, we go to great lengths to look at whether there was any non-randomness in terms of which students were tested, and there does not appear to be. So basically what you should take away from this graph and this table is that mandated testing really was rolled out in conformity with the regulations that the district set up. Most students were being tested each year, and in years when students weren't supposed to be tested, virtually no students were tested. This figure shows you a little bit about the academic calendar and give you a better feel for when students were being tested. The CST test, this is our outcome variable of interest, the score on the statewide math CST, that's administered generally in March. The mandated MDTP, which we just show by MDTP up here, that is generally given in May and June, and that's because it's being given to help teachers decide on recommendations for who should go to summer school and what class kids should be in next year. Voluntary testing by teachers took place throughout the entire school year, but it tended to be bimodal. There was a lot of testing right at the start of the school year, September, so you see that over here on the far left, and also right before the mandated testing. So to some extent, voluntary use of MDTP during this period was being done by teachers to see how their kids were going to do before the mandated testing actually took place. All right, well, let's talk a little bit now about our main findings. I'm going to start here by talking about the mandated testing. And again, what we're doing is we're following individual students over time, trying to figure out their average trajectory in terms of math achievement on the CST, and then we're looking at years and grades when they were in a grade that was mandated for testing. And we're asking the question, in the following year, do we see any benefit or harm being done to students from this testing? Shows the results here. On the vertical axis of this graph, we're showing the achievement percentile. So in other words, a student's rank within his or her grade. And we're taking a hypothetical student who starts in year 0 at the 50th percentile. So that's a student who's right in the middle of the distribution. Our results suggest that if that student was tested at the end of one grade, the next grade the student would rise to just about the 57th percentile. So that's a 7 percentile point change. So for those of you who haven't worked with these recently, you can think of these as rankings. A student at the 57th percentile has the same score or a higher score than 57 out of 100 students on average in the district. So that's a pretty healthy improvement. The dotted blue line in this graph shows what happens in year 2 if the student was tested in 2 consecutive years using MDTP, and you see that there's an additional gain. The student now will be at about the 58th percentile. Now, what about if you only test a student once? That's shown by the red line in this graph. So you get the same gain in year 1 up to about the 57th percentile, but there's a lot of dissipation of that effect 2 years after the mandated testing. The student is still doing better than if he or she hadn't been tested, but there's a drop to just over the 54th percentile. So that's interesting. It's suggesting that if you're going to diagnose student weaknesses, you can't just do that once. You need to keep at it. We have an alternative model in the paper, which we estimate for robustness. We get slightly smaller year 1 effects, but virtually identical year 2 effects. One of our reviewers asked us, who benefits the most from this? Is it students at the bottom end of the test score distribution or the top end? So what we did was to divide students into 3 equal groups, low, medium, and high achievement. And we did this in 2 different ways. The greenish-blue bars show what happens when we ranked people based on their CST score in math from the prior year. The orange bars show what happened when we instead grouped people into low, medium, high based on the first available math score on the CST we could find. So there are advantages and disadvantages to these 2 approaches. Using last year's math CST is a more immediate measure of whether a student was high achieving or low achieving, but the problem is that might partly be a product of whether they were tested in the past with MDTP. The general message from these 2 methods is similar. Number 1, all students seem to benefit. Their test scores rise more than we'd predict the year after testing. Message number 2 is that the group that gets the least from this appears to be the low-achieving students. And this was somewhat surprising to us in the sense that if we're trying to diagnose student weaknesses, it should be that teachers are going to get the most help on specific weaknesses of students if they're at the very low end. And that doesn't seem to be the case. Now, let's turn to voluntary testing. This is the testing that's been ongoing in districts around California literally for decades now. We essentially found that if a student was tested by a voluntary teacher decision between September and March of a given year, there wasn't really an association with math CST scores that fall. If anything, there was a slight negative association. Now, we were concerned here that this is not a natural experiment, and teachers are choosing which classrooms to test. So one of my co-authors, Eugene Hong, got the idea of rerunning the models but controlling for the average test scores of everybody else in the classroom. So how well are your peers doing? It turns out that once you put that in, this negative correlation completely disappears and we essentially get a zero effect. So the lesson we drew from this is that when teachers use this test voluntarily, they're using it on classes that they're really concerned about because they don't seem to be very, very strong. We also looked at voluntary testing in the prior spring. Remember, the state test occurs in March, and some teachers are testing with the MDTP April, May, or June. There was no relationship there to gains. So this is interesting. We don't know if this applies to other districts or not, but it seems like there's a distinct difference between individual teachers making a decision to do this diagnostic testing and an entire district making a decision that everybody in grade 6 or everybody in grade 9 should be given one of these tests. Let's return now to the mandated MDTP testing and ask, why is it that there's such a large effect? So we had some success, not complete success by any means, at trying to get inside the black box and figure out why students were gaining so much the year after mandated testing. Our first hypothesis was that, well, the district had told us that they were using these end-of-the-year tests in part to make decisions about which math class a student should take the following year. Now, I think many of you will probably react negatively to that in the sense that it sounds like ability grouping or tracking. But I'm here to tell you that there are plenty of papers out there that show you that if done the right way, ability grouping can benefit everybody. There's some experimental evidence. It depends on what you do with the ability grouping. If you just sequester poor performing students in classrooms with poorly prepared teachers, that undoubtedly is going to hurt them. On the other hand, if you ability group so that the median student in the classroom is pretty similar to all the students in the classroom, it makes the teacher's job a lot simpler because he or she can really teach that median student and teach to everybody at once without boring some students while leaving other students behind. So we found evidence, clear evidence, that in the year after mandated MDTP testing, the variation in math CST scores within individual math classrooms fell quite a lot. And that really speaks to the idea that there was more nuanced ability grouping going on than before. We then reran our models while taking into account the variation in test scores within a classroom. It turns out the students learn more when there's less variance in test scores within the classroom. Now, how much of this can this effect explain of our very large mandated testing effect? Some. It depends on the model. Between 5 to 11% of the impact of mandated testing can be attributed to this, the better class placement the following year. Now, the other thing the district told us they were doing was using the MDTP tests results along with a bunch of other things, including grades in the classes, to try to come up with better recommendations to parents on whether their children should attend summer school or not. We found that in years when the mandated testing was in place, low-performing students based on the CST were twice as likely to be put into summer school and to actually attend. And summer school, you won't be surprised, actually is correlated with better outcomes the year after. This can only explain, though, 1% of our total MDTP effect. So we're left with a lot that's unexplained here. We're delighted that we can explain some of it. What else could be going on? Well, we think there's an important clue comes from the fact that we didn't really find any positive effects from the voluntary testing, whereas we found quite big effects from the mandated testing. And this is necessarily speculative, but Andy Zhao, Eugene Han and I, my co-authors, we all feel that what might be going on here is that when all of grade 6 is tested, that enables the math department to really engage with the test results, looking not just at individual student results, but looking at weaknesses of the entire cohort and finding better ways to teach students in response to those overall patterns. It also probably makes sense that the grade 7 teacher, knowing that every single student was tested last year in grade 6, is going to be looking at those results at the start of the year. So that could be accounting for some of the large positive effects of mandated testing that we found. So just to sum up here, what have we found? What does it mean for this specific type of testing? Are there implications for the state accountability system? First of all, for mandated testing, we really did find positive gains in the subsequent year. Diagnostic testing seems to work a little bit better if you keep at it. So if you test 2 years in a row, students are better off than if you test them just once. And in fact, if you test students just once, there's a little blip upwards in the first year, but some of that dissipates in the second year unless you do a diagnostic test again. For voluntary testing, we really couldn't identify similar benefits. And in fact, we found a negative correlation of a teacher voluntarily testing students between September and March of a given school year and the math CST score in March of that year. We don't think that's causal. I really want to emphasize that. And a clear sign of this is that once we control for the average achievement in the classroom from the prior year, this whole effect disappears. So what that tells us is that when teachers voluntarily use these tests, they're targeting their classes that they feel are really particularly weak. We can't say whether this lack of a positive effect would carry over to other districts or not, but it's something that we need to take into account because this is the dominant use of these tests statewide. What about California's accountability system? Are there any lessons here? Well, at the start of this talk, I compared and contrasted the MDTP with the CST. And the two clear differences are that the MDTP in most subject areas in math is giving better information on specific student strengths and weaknesses than you can possibly get out of the various strands in the math CST. The other big difference is that teachers get these results back almost instantaneously, whereas the state tests take quite a while to grade. So what's something that we could do here? Well, the first thing would be to computerize the state test would probably lead to teachers getting feedback, maybe not instantaneously, but within the school year. That's something that maybe could help. Before I say anything more, though, I really want to accentuate the bottom point on this slide, which is that you can have two tests for quite distinct things, and it's really hard to come up with a single test that can do both these things. On the one hand, accountability, measuring how well students are doing and how well schools are doing. On the other hand, diagnosing specific student strengths and weaknesses. There's probably room for both of these in the current educational landscape. Final thing I'll say is that this whole idea of computerizing state tests was pretty far out 6 months ago, in the sense that California is obviously going through some very difficult financial times. But as most of you know, California has recently signed on as one of the 18 governing states in the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium. And that's really important because this consortium is going to develop computerized tests. They're going to be national tests in English language arts and math, and presumably these might even be in place by 2014. So the move towards tests that where teachers get the feedback next year versus teachers getting the feedback almost immediately, maybe only 3 years away. And I think this could do a lot to make the accountability system more useful to teachers in terms of improving performance. So I'll stop there, and we've got lots of time for questions. So.